Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our hope. Amen. Many contemporary biblical scholars suggest that in the Gospel of John, any of the words attributed to Jesus, unless they are corroborated by the other Gospels, should be considered suspect. That doesn't mean they're not true. They're just saying that Jesus may not have actually said that. And there's several reasons for that. The Gospel of John generally is considered to be much later than the other Gospels. In fact, so much later that it is unlikely that the author of the Gospel of John even knew someone who had known Jesus. The manner in which the Gospel is written also tends to reflect not just a later period in time, but also that the author has spent time with the community of the followers of Jesus in a way that has allowed them to understand where that community is at towards the end of the first century. And where it's at is there's a lot of doubt. They have a lot of questions. Jesus hasn't returned like he said he would, for starters, but also there are a lot of challenges from the Jewish community, from the Roman community, from pretty much everyone else. And faith is lagging a little bit. And that seems to be reflected in how the author of John tells the story. Because the author of John doesn't tell the story just as a narrative or in a practical way like the other Gospels. The other Gospels all have their themes, of course, because they reflect different writers. But John's is more metaphysical. It's more like he understands where the people are at and he's writing for them. And I think one of the places where that's most obviously reflected is in that last night, the night of the Last Supper, when John tells that story quite differently. He has Jesus model a very concrete example of service, and then he talks to them. And he says a lot of very important stuff. And again, here's a place where many contemporary biblical scholars will tell you Jesus may not have said exactly that. For my money, though, to be honest, I think even if that's not the exact words of Jesus, that was sure as heck somebody being Jesus. Sorry, I'm going to say that differently. Somebody who was really Jesusing. Because not only is it true and it sounds like Jesus, it's Jesus. It's what Jesus is all about. And I think this is what Jesus is all about in two very concrete ways. One is that he seems to go on and on and on in a very repetitive way about a particular point in this passage that we heard, in a way that sounds a little bit like you might be tempted to think one of the disciples at the end of it went, "What?" But the point is very simple. God is in me, I am in you. It's love, that's what that is, that connection, and the power of it is the Spirit. How that all plays out and how it works is very complicated, but I think the message is that simple. God is in me, Jesus, I am in you. When we love each other, then you are in me and I am in God. And God is in me and I am in you. We are one in the Spirit. That is the energy, the power to it. I think it was really important for the author of John to make sure that Jesus was saying these things and saying these things at this moment, because they knew they were writing for a community that was feeling just like the disciples would have been feeling in that moment. Imagine you're there. You just had a really awesome thing last Sunday. People were like cheering for Jesus. It was awesome. It was great. The temple authorities were really mad about that. And the week has not gone very well since. And, there was those times prior to that when it sure sounded like people were drifting away from Jesus, or they were mad about something he said, or the temple authorities were actually really mad. And he did say some things that sounded like the Romans could get upset about that too. And here he is talking about how where I'm going now, you can't come. Oh, and why did Judas just leave? What was Jesus talking about to Judas? It's something about betrayal? What's going on? You can imagine the disciples being a little anxious, a little fearful. They might have had some doubts about how successful things were going to be. They were certainly probably worried about what might be in the future. I think that's what the author of John was experiencing in his own community in those days. Actually, it should sound familiar because it might well be what we're experiencing now. This is kind of a story for now. Because Jesus' response to that isn't just to say, it's okay, it's going to be fine. It's to talk about how we are one in the Spirit, that God is with us, that God is in me, I am in you. The Spirit will always be with you. How do you think the disciples responded in that moment? Do you think they felt reassured? Do you think they kind of were shaking their heads and like, I don't know? Because I think what the author of John was trying to get at here was Jesus saying, you need to reset your heart and mind. Whatever you're experiencing, and remember how many times I said don't be afraid, whatever you're experiencing right now, you cannot approach that with fear, with anxiety. You won't be able to address the future unless you can find a way to approach it with vision, with hope. And so here's Jesus offering just that. The Spirit will always be with you. I will always be with you. A few weeks ago, Chinook Winds region, of which we are a part, had an annual meeting in Lacombe, at which the keynote speaker was the moderator. And over the last year or so, the moderator has been traveling across the country presenting this workshop called Flourishing. And the idea of it is to try and encourage people to reset their thinking for the future. And at the very beginning of it, she introduced this short video, which I'm going to show you, which is a really interesting way to think about how you might need to reset your thinking in order to go forward.
Location, location, location. Brought to you by the Conscious Leadership Group. Find them on the web at www.conscious.is. Animation by Graham Franks. www.grahamfranks.com. One question that conscious leaders ask themselves over and over is, where am I? To support leaders in locating themselves as they ask the question, where am I? We offer this tool, a line, a simple black line. At any moment, all leaders and all people are either above the line or below the line. Our location describes how we're being with what is occurring in our life right now. If we're above the line, we are open, curious, and committed to learning. If we are below the line, we are closed, defensive, and committed to being right. Stop right now and simply ask yourself, where am I? In this now moment, am I above the line or below the line? Typically, when people are below the line, they believe certain things about the world. For example, they believe there is not enough. It could be that there's not enough money, or time, or space, or energy, or love. People below the line also believe that their story about the situation is right. People below the line also believe that there is a threat out there. Something or someone is threatening their desire for approval, control, or security. And people below the line see the situation as serious. The deeper below the line they are, the more serious things look. People below the line tend to behave certain ways as well. They tend to cling to an opinion, find fault and blame, gossip, explain, rationalize and justify, get overwhelmed, and avoid conflict or pursue conflict for the sake of winning. When people are above the line, they believe that learning and growing are more important than being right. They believe that all people and circumstances are their allies, here for their growth. They believe that from a distance, almost everything is funny. People above the line live in curiosity, listen deeply, speak unarguably, question all their beliefs, and live a life of play. Now, knowing what you know about being above or below the line, where are you? One thing to know as you consider this question: we are hardwired to go below the line. Literally, our brain is programmed to perceive threat, and when it does, a chemical cocktail courses through our veins, and we go below the line. This reaction was designed to help us survive in the presence of a real threat to our physical survival. An issue for modern-day leaders is that often our brains can't tell the difference between a threat to our physical survival and a threat to our ego or identity. We react and get defensive when we experience a threat to our ego. So in many ways, being below the line is natural and normal. But when we are below the line, we're not in a state, literally brain state, of high creativity, collaboration, innovation, and relational connection. We're simply trying to survive. Leaders today can't thrive if they're in survival mode. So the first activity of conscious leadership is location, location, location. In this now moment, where am I? Telling ourselves and others the truth about our current location begins the great conversation.
In this moment, and just before you think that, just imagine the disciples with Jesus in the story. And Jesus, if Jesus were to, out of the blue, say, "Where are you right now? How are you feeling?" See, I think all of the disciples were feeling below the line. And I got to admit, there are times when, there are lots of times when I feel like I'm below the line. Where are you? Now, you might also then want to respond to this by saying, yes, but that's designed for leaders. I'm not really a leader. Yes, you are. We all are. In our own lives, first of all, but even within families, communities of faith, the manner in which we live leads. That was a really important thing that I think Jesus was trying to get across to the disciples. How you live leads, because other people will see it. You can say all you want, but how you live your life is what people will really see. We are entering into a future that we're not really sure about in a lot of ways, in the world particularly. But also, here's the United Church at 100 years. It's a great opportunity to look back and celebrate some really amazing things. It's also an opportunity to look back and consider some of the things that are really only worth celebrating from what we learn from them. And we hope that we did. But where are we going now? When I heard that the moderator was bringing this flourishing thing to the annual meeting. I have to admit, my first thought was, why? You are bringing that to a part of the country where there are a lot of small rural churches who are either on the verge of closing or are about to. There's a lot of small rural churches that don't have ministers. There's a lot of churches that are worried about their future. But that's just the point. She's not suggesting for a moment that there aren't challenges. But what she's suggesting is a change in our heart set that affects our mindset. If the Spirit is there and we can find ourselves above the line, we are prepared to ask questions and be curious. We're prepared to take risks, to collaborate. And collaborating is so much harder than partnering, isn't it? When we partner with somebody, I'll just unpack that for a second. When we partner with somebody, we put in what we bring in order to get something out of it. We know we want to get something out. And I think the thing about collaborating is you have to go into it with a certain sense of vulnerability because you're trying to create something new. And that might mean you have to give up some things, like complete control of things. You might need to let others do. And instead of approaching that as, oh, I've got to give up something, could we approach that with, I'm giving them the gift of that responsibility. I'm giving myself the gift of not having to be the sole person responsible for that because we are collaborating. We are all in this together. We are one. There's lots of things to be concerned about in the future. There are lots of things to be concerned about in the moment. But where we find ourselves now will only take us into the future if we are prepared to risk and ask questions and collaborate with others, to be open to hearing what others have to say, to be willing to find ourselves connecting with people that we might previously have thought we don't. That all is the power of the Spirit that Jesus tells us is here. That Jesus shows us is here in the life he lived. The life that we are all capable of living.